Get out, and let's see how tough you feel when you have no way to get home. Jessica laughed, her voice cutting through the Scottish Highland air like a blade. Brian gunned the rental car engine, gravel spraying from the tires as they disappeared down the winding country road, leaving me standing alone with my suitcase on a patch of grass that barely qualified as a village square. That's when I realized my own daughter had just declared war on me. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Now, let me back up and tell you exactly how a 67-year-old American grandmother ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere, Scotland, because trust me, it wasn't on any travel brochure I'd ever seen. 3 weeks earlier, Jessica had called me with what she claimed was exciting news. Mom, Brian's company is sending him to Edinburgh for a conference, and we thought it would be wonderful if you joined us for a little family vacation afterward. I should have known something was off when she used the word wonderful. Jessica hadn't found anything about me wonderful since her teenage years. But like the fool I apparently was, I'd gotten excited. When was the last time my daughter had invited me anywhere? When was the last time she'd wanted to spend time with me that didn't involve babysitting her kids or lending her money? So I'd booked my flight, packed my best clothes, and even bought a new camera to document our wonderful family trip. The trouble started the moment I met them at Edinburgh Airport. Jessica took one look at my outfit, a perfectly respectable pantsuit I'd bought specifically for the trip, and rolled her eyes so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out. Really, Mom? You're going to dress like a librarian the entire time we're here? Brian, ever the charmer, had smirked from behind his phone. At least she matches the scenery, all those old castles and museums. I'd bitten my tongue, determined not to let their rudeness ruin what I'd hoped would be a chance to reconnect. For 3 days, I'd followed them around Edinburgh like a third wheel they couldn't shake. When they wanted to eat at expensive restaurants, I'd paid without complaint. When they wanted to shop for things they couldn't afford, I'd handed over my credit card with a smile. When they'd booked us into separate hotel rooms because everyone needs their space, I'd agreed cheerfully. Yesterday morning, Brian had announced we were taking a scenic drive through the Highlands. "You'll love it, Margaret," he'd said, using my full name the way he always did when he was being condescending. Very authentic Scottish experience. The drive had been beautiful. I'll give him that. Rolling hills covered in purple heather. Ancient stone bridges crossing streams that sparkled in the September sunlight. For a moment, sitting in the back seat of their rental car, I'd actually felt grateful to be there with them. That was before Jessica turned around with that familiar expression of barely controlled irritation. "Mom, can you please stop taking pictures of every sheep and rock we pass? You're making the whole car shake." "I'm documenting our trip," I'd said mildly. "For what? Your Instagram account that doesn't exist?" Brian had laughed at his own joke. "For my memory. I want to remember this time with you." That's when Jessica's expression had changed, hardening into something I didn't recognize. Our time together. Right. She'd exchanged a look with Brian that made my stomach clench. "Actually, Mom, there's something we need to talk to you about." And that's how I'd learned. Somewhere between a centuries-old stone church and this godforsaken village called Kilbride that probably had more sheep than people, that I was apparently a burden they could no longer carry. "We've been patient with you for years," Jessica had said, her voice rising with each word. "But you're suffocating us. You're always there, always wanting to be included, always acting like we owe you something just because you're our mother." Now here I stood, watching their taillights disappear around a bend in the road with exactly 43 pounds in my wallet, a dead cell phone, and the sinking realization that my own daughter had just abandoned me in a foreign country like an unwanted pet. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same daughter I'd raised alone after her father walked out when she was 12. The silence after their car disappeared was absolute. No traffic, no voices, just wind whistling through what looked like the remains of an old stone church and the distant bleating of sheep. I stood there for a full minute, suitcase handle gripping tight in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. My first coherent thought was remarkably practical. I needed to find a phone. The second thought was less helpful. What kind of mother raises a daughter capable of this level of cruelty? But standing here feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get me back to civilization, so I picked up my suitcase and started walking toward what appeared to be the village center. And I use the term center loosely. We're talking about maybe 6 stone buildings clustered around what might charitably be called a main street. The first building looked like it hadn't been occupied since the Highland clans roamed these hills. The second appeared to be someone's house, but the windows were dark and there were no signs of life. The third building had a faded sign hanging askew that read, Kilbride Post Office. But when I tried the door, it was locked tight. Wonderful, I muttered, and immediately heard Jessica's voice in my head mocking my word choice. Even abandoned in the Scottish Highlands, I couldn't escape my daughter's criticism. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of music coming from somewhere up the street. Real music, with actual instruments, not some ghostly Highland bagpipe echoing across the moors. I followed the sound like a beacon, dragging my suitcase behind me over cobblestones that had probably been there since before America was even discovered. The music led me to a building that looked marginally more alive than the others. A wooden sign creaked in the wind, The Shepherd's Rest, Inn and Public House. Through windows that could have used a good cleaning, I could see warm light and the silhouettes of people inside. I stood outside that door for longer than I care to admit, trying to gather the courage to go inside. What was I going to say? Excuse me, but my daughter just dumped me here like a bag of garbage and I need to use your phone? It sounded pathetic, even in my head. But standing in the Scottish wind wasn't going to improve my situation, so I pushed open that heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped the moment I appeared. Not gradually, not politely. It just died, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire room. 6 or 7 people, all locals by the look of them, turned to stare at the American woman with the suitcase who'd just interrupted their evening. Evening, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if I might use your phone. I seem to find myself in a bit of a situation. A woman behind the bar, probably in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. American, are ye? Her accent was thick but warm. What brings ye to Kilbride with a suitcase at this hour? And that's when the absurdity of my situation hit me full force. I started laughing. Not happy laughter. The slightly hysterical kind that bubbles up when your life becomes so ridiculous you can't process it normally. My daughter, I managed between gasps, just left me here because apparently I'm a burden she can no longer carry. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Then the woman behind the bar, her name was Moira, I learned later, said something that surprised me. Well then, she's a right fool, isn't she? Come on, sit yourself down and tell us what happened. For the next hour, over a cup of tea that was strong enough to wake the dead, I told my story to a group of Scottish strangers who listened without judgment. They asked practical questions. Did I have money for a hotel? Could I get to Edinburgh on my own? Did I want them to call the police? That last question gave me pause. Did I want to call the police on my own daughter? The thought was tempting in the darkest corners of my mind. But what would that accomplish besides adding humiliation to abandonment? No police, I said finally, but I would appreciate directions to the nearest town with a hotel. That's when Moira delivered the news that made my situation go from bad to worse. The nearest proper hotel is in Stirling, about 40 miles south, but there's no bus service here, and the taxi would cost you more than you likely have. She was right. £43 wouldn't cover a taxi to the next village, let alone a hotel room and meals while I figured out how to get home. However, Moira continued, and I heard hope creeping into her voice, we do have a room upstairs that we rent out sometimes. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm. £20 for the night, breakfast included. I wanted to hug this woman. £20 I could afford, and it would give me time to think, to plan, to figure out how to get out of this mess with whatever dignity I had left. As I climbed those narrow stairs behind Moira, suitcase bumping against the worn wooden banister, I caught a glimpse of myself in an old mirror hanging in the hallway. My hair was disheveled from the wind, my carefully planned outfit wrinkled from travel, and my eyes looked shell-shocked. But underneath the shock, something else was stirring, something that felt surprisingly like determination. Jessica thought she could dump me here and break me? She was about to learn that her mother was tougher than she remembered. The room above the Shepherd's Rest was exactly as Moira had described. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. A single bed with a thick wool blanket, a wash basin with running water, and a small window that looked out over the village square where I'd been abandoned just hours earlier. I sat on that bed and made a list in my head of everything I needed to do. Find a way to charge my phone, contact my bank to access more money, book transportation back to Edinburgh, and somehow get home to Minnesota. Simple enough in theory. In practice, it felt overwhelming. The phone charging turned out to be easy enough. Moira had a universal adapter behind the bar. While it powered up, she served me a dinner that I hadn't ordered but desperately needed. Thick Scottish soup, fresh bread, and a glass of red wine that loosened the knot in my chest. "So," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "what's your plan then?" "Survive until I can get home," I said honestly, "and try to figure out how my relationship with my daughter became so broken that she could do something like this." Moira nodded thoughtfully. "Families are complicated things. I've got a son in Glasgow who thinks I'm too old to run this place by myself. Keeps sending me brochures for assisted living facilities." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. As if 20 years of running an inn has suddenly made me incompetent overnight. "Children," I said, raising my wine glass, "apparently think they know what's best for us." "Apparently," she agreed, clinking her glass against mine. That's when my phone finally came back to life, buzzing with a dozen missed calls and twice as many text messages. My heart jumped. Maybe Jessica had realized what she'd done. Maybe she was coming back. Maybe this nightmare was over. But when I scrolled through the messages, my hope curdled into something much darker. They weren't from Jessica at all. They were from my bank. "Unusual account activity. Please confirm these transactions. Your debit card has been declined." My hands started shaking as I called the customer service number. After 10 minutes on hold and another 10 minutes of verification questions, I learned the truth. Jessica had been making charges on my account all week. Hotel rooms, meals, shopping trips, even a spa day yesterday while I thought she was visiting a museum. But the real shock came when I asked about my savings account balance. The account that should have had nearly $60,000 had less than $800. "Ma'am, you authorized these transfers to your daughter's account 3 months ago," the customer service representative explained patiently. "We have the signed documents in our files. Signed documents I'd never seen, let alone signed." Jessica had somehow gotten access to my accounts and had been systematically draining them. The abandonment in Scotland wasn't emotional cruelty. It was the final step in what had apparently been a months-long plan to steal everything I had. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. Moira, who'd been politely pretending not to listen, took one look at my face and poured me another glass of wine without saying a word. "It's worse than I thought," I finally managed to say. And then, because keeping it inside felt like it might kill me, I told her everything. The unauthorized transfers, the forged documents, the systematic theft that had been going on for months without my knowledge. "That's not just abandonment," Moira said quietly when I finished. "That's elder abuse, financial abuse. It's a crime." "It's my daughter," I said, as if that somehow made it less criminal. "Makes it worse." "Not better," she replied firmly. "Family members who do this know exactly how much damage they're causing." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the murmur of conversation from the locals still gathered around the fireplace downstairs. Finally, Moira spoke again. "How long can you stay here?" "With what money ye have left?" I did the math in my head. "Maybe a week, if I'm careful." "Then we have a week to figure out how to get ye back on your feet," she said matter-of-factly. "We? You think I'm going to let some American grandmother get swindled by her own child and not help? I may run a pub in the middle of nowhere, but I still have principles." The kindness from this stranger who owed me nothing was almost harder to bear than my daughter's betrayal. I hadn't cried since Jessica's car disappeared, but suddenly the tears came hard and fast. Moira handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I fell apart. When I finally composed myself, she was still sitting there with a determined expression I was beginning to recognize. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start fighting back." I looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. "I don't even know where to begin." "Lucky for ye," Moira smiled grimly. "I do. My late husband used to say that when someone shows ye who they really are, you better believe them. Your daughter has shown ye exactly who she is. Now it's time to show her who you are." That night, Lying in the narrow bed, listening to the Highland wind rattle the windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going home broken and defeated. I was going home stronger than I'd ever been. Jessica thought she'd destroyed me. She had no idea what she'd actually done. She'd set me free. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, which seemed appropriate for my mood, until Moira appeared at my door with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the Highland ghosts, and a smile that suggested she'd been doing some serious thinking overnight. "Get dressed," she announced. "We have work to do." "What kind of work?" I asked. But she was already heading back downstairs, leaving me to wonder what this formidable Scottish woman had planned. 20 minutes later, I found myself following Moira down a muddy path behind the inn, through a gate I hadn't noticed yesterday, and toward what looked like an abandoned stone building, about the size of a small warehouse. The structure was old, probably centuries old, with thick walls and narrow windows, but the roof looked solid and the door was secured with a relatively modern lock. "What is this place?" I asked, as Moira produced a large iron key from her coat pocket. "Used to be a wool warehouse," she said, working the lock. "Back when this area was part of the sheep farming route between the Highlands and Glasgow. My husband's grandfather bought it in the 1950s, thinking he'd convert it into something profitable. Never got around to it." The door swung open with a rusty creak, and Moira stepped inside, gesturing for me to follow. What I saw took my breath away. The building was filled with furniture, artwork, china, books, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of collected antiques, all covered with dust sheets and organized in rough categories throughout the space. Celtic pottery sat next to Victorian writing desks. Oil paintings in ornate frames leaned against walls next to collections of vintage books with leather bindings. "Good Lord," I breathed, pulling a dust sheet off what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden chest with brass fittings. "How long has all this been here?" "Decades," Moira said, walking deeper into the warehouse. "People would bring things here when they moved, died, downsized. My husband never had the heart to turn anyone away, and he was always convinced he'd get around to sorting through it all someday. After he died 5 years ago, I just locked the door and tried to forget about it." I ran my fingers along the surface of the wooden chest. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and despite the dust, I could see the rich grain of what looked like mahogany underneath. "Moira, some of this could be quite valuable." "That's what I'm hoping," she said, turning to face me with a businesslike expression. "Because I have a proposition for ye." I looked up from the chest, waiting. "I need help cataloging and researching all this," she continued. "There's probably enough here to fill an antique shop, but I don't know what's worth selling and what's worth keeping. Yeah, on the other hand, spent 30 years as a museum coordinator back in America. Didn't you mention that last night?" I had mentioned it, during one of my rambling explanations of how I'd ended up in Scotland. Before my marriage, before Jessica, I'd worked at the Minnesota History Museum, specializing in historical artifacts and their preservation. It felt like a lifetime ago. "That was a long time ago," I said carefully. "Skills like that don't expire," Moira said firmly. "And here's my offer. Ye help me sort through all this, research what we've got, maybe even help me set up some sort of selling operation, and I'll split the profits with you 50-50. I stared at her. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know ye were abandoned by someone who should have protected ye. I know you're smart enough to have managed a museum collection. I know you need money to get back on your feet. And I know I'm sitting on what could be a small fortune if we do this right." I walked deeper into the warehouse, pulling back more dust sheets. A set of Wedgwood china, complete and without visible chips. A collection of first-edition books that made my museum curator heart skip a beat. A painting that looked suspiciously like it might be a minor Scottish master from the 18th century. "This could take months," I said. "Good," Moira replied, "because I've got plenty of time, and now you do too." She was right. Jessica's betrayal had inadvertently given me something I hadn't had in years: complete freedom from family obligations. No grandchildren to babysit, no daughter to enable, no one expecting me to be the accommodating mother who never made waves. "What about selling what we find?" I asked. "I don't know anything about the antique market here." Moira smiled. "That's where it gets interesting. My neighbor's nephew runs an auction house in Edinburgh. High-end stuff, mostly. He's been after me for years to let him evaluate some of the pieces that have been sitting here. Never seemed worth the trouble before, but with two of us working on it, I picked up what appeared to be a small porcelain figurine, turning it over to look at the maker's mark on the bottom. My museum training kicked in automatically, and I felt a familiar thrill of recognition. "Moira," I said slowly, "this is a Royal Dalton figure from their early production period. If it's authentic and in good condition, it could be worth several £100." Her eyes widened. "For that little thing?" "For that little thing." I set it down carefully and looked around the warehouse with new eyes. If this one small piece was valuable, and it had been chosen essentially at random from hundreds of items. "We're going to need better lighting," I said, and realized I was already planning our attack on this treasure trove. "Is that a yes, then?" I thought about Jessica, probably back in Edinburgh by now, assuming I was stranded and helpless. I thought about my depleted bank accounts and my uncertain future. Then I looked around this warehouse full of possibilities and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. "It's a yes," I said, "but I want 60-40 split and I want it in writing." Moira laughed and stuck out her hand. 60-40 and a proper contract. I knew I liked you. As we shook hands, surrounded by decades of forgotten treasures, I couldn't help but smile. Jessica thought she'd left me with nothing? She'd actually left me with the first real opportunity I'd had in years to build something that belonged entirely to me. 3 weeks later, I was covered in dust, my fingernails were permanently stained, and I'd never been happier. Moira and I had established a routine that worked like a well-oiled machine. Mornings spent carefully cataloging items in the warehouse. Afternoons researching their history and value, using the surprisingly good internet connection at the Shepherd's Rest, and evenings planning our next moves. The Royal Dalton figurine had been just the beginning. We'd found a complete set of Edinburgh crystal that was worth more than my car back home. A collection of Victorian jewelry that made my heart race when I looked up comparable pieces online. And yesterday, wrapped in what looked like old bed linens at the very back of the warehouse, we'd discovered something that made both of us stop and stare. "That's not just any painting," I'd told Moira, carefully examining the canvas with the magnifying glass we'd bought in the village. "Look at this brushwork. Look at the signature in the corner." The painting was small, maybe 18 inches by 12, but it was exquisite. A highland landscape with the kind of detail and color saturation that spoke of true artistic skill. And in the bottom right corner, partially obscured by years of grime, was a signature that made my museum curator's heart pound. A. Nasmyth. Alexander Nasmyth, the father of Scottish landscape painting. If this was authentic, we weren't looking at hundreds of pounds, we were looking at thousands. "How do we know for sure?" Moira had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We get it properly appraised," I'd said, already making plans. "But first, we need to have it professionally cleaned and examined." That's how we'd ended up making our first trip to Edinburgh since I'd started my new life as an accidental antique dealer. Moira drove us in her ancient Land Rover, the carefully wrapped painting secured in the back seat like precious cargo. The art authentication service Moira's nephew had recommended operated out of a converted warehouse in Edinburgh's Old Town. The expert who examined our painting was a woman about my age named Dr. Catherine Murray, with sharp eyes and gentle hands that spoke of decades of experience handling priceless artworks. "Where did you acquire this?" she asked as she carefully unwrapped the painting and set it on her examination table. "It's been in storage for decades," Moira explained. "Part of an estate collection." "Dr. Sao." Murray nodded and began her examination, using tools and techniques I recognized from my museum days. After what felt like hours, she finally looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "It's authentic," she said simply. "Mid-period Nasmyth, probably painted around 1820. Subject matter is consistent with his work from that time, and the provenance makes sense. This area of Scotland was one of his favorite painting locations." Moira and I exchanged glances. "And the value?" Moira asked. "At auction, assuming proper documentation and provenance research, I'd estimate between 15 and 20,000 pounds. I actually gasped. 20,000 pounds for one small painting that had been gathering dust in a Scottish warehouse. if this was representative of what we might find in the rest of the collection. However, Dr. Murray continued, and my heart sank, there's something else you should know. She pulled up a database on her computer screen and turned it toward us. I ran the painting through our record system, and there's a notation here from 1987. This piece was reported as part of a collection that went missing from the McLeod estate when the family lost their property to creditors. My stomach dropped. Missing as in stolen? Not necessarily stolen, Dr. Murray said carefully. More likely sold privately to settle debts, but without proper documentation of the sale. It's not uncommon with estate collections from that era. Families in financial trouble often sold pieces quietly to avoid public scrutiny. So we can't sell it? Moira asked, the disappointment clear in her voice. You can, but you'd need to do more research first. Find documentation of how the piece came to be in your warehouse. Establish a clear chain of ownership. It's doable, but it takes time and potentially some legal assistance. As we drove back to Kilbride, the painting secured once again in the back seat, I found myself thinking not about the potential complications, but about the possibilities. If we had one authentic Nasmyth, what else might be hidden in that warehouse? And more importantly, I was discovering that I had skills I'd forgotten I possessed. You look like you're scheming, Moira observed from the driver's seat. I'm thinking, I corrected, about how to research the provenance of that painting, about what other treasures might be waiting for us, and about how your warehouse is about to become the most organized antique collection in Scotland. Sounds like scheming to me, she said with a grin. That evening, as I sat in my little room above the pub with my laptop, researching estate sales and auction records from the 1980s, I caught myself smiling. For the first time since my husband died 2 years ago, I felt useful. More than useful. I felt necessary. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart jumped. Maybe Jessica had finally realized what she'd done. Maybe she was ready to apologize, to make things right. But the message wasn't from Jessica. It was from my sister Linda back in Minnesota. Haven't heard from you since your Scotland trip. How are you doing? Call me. I looked at that message for a long time before typing back. I'm doing better than I have in years. I'll call you soon with news. Because I was beginning to suspect that Jessica's betrayal, painful as it had been, might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I was about to find out just how right I was. The breakthrough came exactly 6 weeks after I'd been abandoned in Kilbride, and it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. I was knee-deep in research about Scottish estate sales from the 1980s when Moira knocked on my door with the expression that I'd learned meant she had news. There's someone downstairs who wants to meet ye, she said. Says he knew your family. My family? I hadn't mentioned having any family connections to Scotland, mostly because I hadn't thought I had any. My grandparents had immigrated to Minnesota from somewhere in Europe, but the family stories had always been vague, and with both parents long dead, I'd never pursued the genealogy research. The man waiting in the pub's small sitting room was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He stood when I entered, extending a hand with a smile that seemed genuine. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Duncan MacLeod. I believe we may be related. MacLeod, the same name Dr. Murray had mentioned in connection with the missing painting. This couldn't be a coincidence. Please, sit, I said, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. How did you know to find me here? Word travels fast in the Highlands, he said with a chuckle, especially when an American woman starts poking around in old estate records and asking questions about missing artwork. My solicitor in Edinburgh mentioned that someone was researching the 1987 auction of my father's collection. My blood ran cold. If this man was connected to the MacLeod estate, and if our painting had been part of that collection, I see from your expression that you know what I'm talking about, Duncan continued gently. The Nasmyth landscape, specifically. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Well, I have some news that might surprise ye. That painting was never stolen, and it was never lost. He pulled a manila folder from his jacket and set it on the table between us. It was given as a gift to your great-grandmother, Margaret MacLeod Caldwell, in 1921, when she emigrated to America. The world tilted sideways. My great-grandmother? Margaret MacLeod, he said, opening the folder to reveal old documents and photographs. My great-aunt. She married an American businessman named William Caldwell, who was visiting Scotland on business. When they left for America, my great-grandfather gave her several family pieces as a dowry, including the Nasmyth painting. I stared at the documents he was showing me: immigration records, marriage certificates, and most importantly, a detailed inventory of items given to Margaret MacLeod upon her marriage, signed and witnessed in 1921. But how did it end up in the warehouse here? I asked, my head spinning. Duncan smiled sadly. Margaret came back to Scotland in 1949 after her husband died. She was in poor health and didn't have any children yet. That came later with her second marriage. She stayed with our family for several months, but she was too ill to travel back to America with all her possessions. So she left them in our care with instructions to hold them until she could return for them. And she never came back? She did, actually. In 1952, with her new husband and a baby daughter, your grandmother. But by then, she was happy in her new life in America. And she told my grandfather to keep the items or do with them as he saw fit. He stored them in various places around the property. I was having trouble processing this information. So the painting belonged to my family all along? More than that, Duncan said, pulling out another document. According to Scottish inheritance law, and given that you're Margaret's direct descendant and the only surviving member of that family line, everything she left behind legally belongs to you. Everything? The painting is just the beginning. There were jewelry pieces, china, several other artworks, and some family documents that your great-grandmother thought might be of interest to her descendants someday. My hands were shaking as I reached for the inventory list. The items Duncan was describing weren't just valuable, they represented a family history I'd never known existed. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. You could have kept quiet and let me continue thinking the painting was stolen. Duncan's expression grew serious. Because I'm dying, Mrs. Caldwell. Cancer. And I've been researching our family genealogy, trying to tie up loose ends. When I discovered you existed and that you were here in Scotland, it seemed like providence. We spent the next 3 hours going through documents, photographs, and family stories. By the time Duncan left, I had legal documentation proving my ownership of not just the Nasmyth painting, but of a collection of Scottish artifacts worth potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds. That evening, Moira and I sat in the pub after closing time, surrounded by the documents Duncan had left with me. Well, she said finally, this changes things considerably. It does, I agreed. The question is, what do we do now? Now, Moira said with a grin, we stop being small-time antique dealers and start being serious collectors. Because if ye own a legitimate collection of this caliber, we're not talking about local auction houses anymore. We're talking about Sotheby's. I looked at the inventory list again, still hardly believing it was real. 6 weeks ago, Jessica had abandoned me here thinking she'd left me with nothing. Instead, she'd inadvertently led me to a family legacy I never knew existed. My phone buzzed with another text from Linda. Margaret, I'm worried about you. Please call me. This time, I picked up the phone and dialed her number immediately. Linda, I said when she answered, you're never going to believe what I have to tell you. Because I was about to become a very wealthy woman, and Jessica was going to discover that abandoning me in Scotland had been the biggest mistake of her life. But first, I had some serious business to conduct. The first auction at Sotheby's Edinburgh was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 4 months after Jessica had dumped me on that Scottish roadside. As I stood in the elegant auction house watching wealthy collectors examine my great-grandmother's Nasmyth painting, I couldn't help but think about the irony of it all. The woman Jessica had abandoned as a worthless burden was about to become rather wealthy. Lot 47, Alexander Nasmyth Highland Landscape. Oil on canvas, circa 1820, the auctioneer announced. Bidding starts at £8,000. My heart hammered as hands went up around the room. 8 became 12, 12 became 16, 16 became 22. Moira squeezed my arm when the bidding hit 25,000, but it wasn't over yet. £30,000, called a voice from the back of the room. 35,000 to the gentleman in the front row. 40,000. When the hammer finally fell at £47,000, I had to sit down. One small painting that had been gathering dust in a Scottish warehouse had just sold for more money than I'd made in 2 years at my old job. And it was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, we sold 12 pieces from my inherited collection. The Edinburgh crystal brought in 8,000. A set of Victorian jewelry fetched 15,000. A collection of rare Scottish books from the 18th century sold for £22,000 to a private collector in London. By the end of January, my bank account showed a balance I'd never dreamed possible. More importantly, I'd discovered I had a genuine talent for this business. My museum background, combined with Moira's local knowledge and practical sense, had created something special. "We should make this permanent," Moira said over dinner one evening in February. "I mean really permanent. Not just you helping me clear out the warehouse, but a proper antique business." I looked around the Shepherd's Rest, which had become more home to me than anywhere I'd lived in years. "What did you have in mind?" "Partnership. 50-50, like we agreed in the beginning. We convert part of the warehouse into a proper showroom, maybe expand into estate sales and appraisals. I handle the local connections, ye handle the research and authentication." It was exactly what I'd been hoping she'd suggest, but hadn't dared to bring up myself. "MacLeod and Caldwell Antiquities? Has a nice ring to it," Moira grinned. That's when my phone rang. The number on the screen made my blood freeze. Jessica. I hadn't heard from my daughter since she'd driven away and left me stranded. For 7 months, she'd maintained complete radio silence, apparently content to let me disappear from her life entirely. Now, suddenly, she was calling. "Answer it," Moira said quietly. "Time to find out what she wants." I hit the answer button with hands that weren't quite steady. "Hello, Jessica." "Mom." Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Interesting. I checked my phone logs. No missed calls from her number." "Have you? Your old number wasn't working, and nobody seemed to know where you were. I finally got this number from Aunt Linda." "Ah, so Linda had given her my Scottish phone number. What do you want, Jessica?" "I want to apologize," she said, and for a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. "What Brian and I did, leaving you there, it was inexcusable." "Yes, it was. We were stressed, and we'd been fighting, and we took it out on you in the worst possible way. I know that, and I know a phone call can't fix what we did." I waited, saying nothing. 7 months of silence had taught me the power of letting other people fill uncomfortable pauses. Are you still in Scotland?" she asked finally. "I am. Mom, please come home. Come back to Minnesota. I know we have a lot to work through, but I miss you. Brian and I both miss you." The old Margaret might have melted at those words. The old Margaret had spent years craving exactly this kind of acknowledgement from her daughter. But the new Margaret, the one who'd built a successful business and a new life, recognized the manipulation in her daughter's voice. "Why now, Jessica? After 7 months of complete silence, why are you suddenly calling?" A pause. Then, "Does it matter why? I'm trying to make things right." "It matters to me." Another pause. Longer this time. "Fine. I saw something online, a news article about auction sales in Scotland. There was a picture of you with some antique dealer, and it mentioned that you'd sold some family collection for a lot of money." And there it was. Jessica hadn't called because she missed me or felt guilty about abandoning me. She'd called because she'd learned I had money again. "I see," I said quietly. "Look, I know what you're thinking, but that's not why I'm calling. I mean, yes, I saw the article, but I would have called anyway. I've been planning to call for weeks." "Have you? Mom, please, can we try to fix this? I could come to Scotland, or you could come home, and we could work things out like adults." I looked across the table at Moira, who was listening to every word with an expression of barely contained fury. Then I looked out the window at the Scottish countryside that had become my sanctuary, my new beginning, my real home. "I'm not coming back to Minnesota, Jessica. But you have to. Your life is here, your friends, your house. You made me sell my house, remember? And my life is here now." The silence stretched out so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke again, and this time, the little girl voice was completely gone, replaced by something harder. "Fine, then I'll come to you." Jessica arrived in Scotland 3 weeks later, and she didn't come alone. She brought Brian, of course, but she also brought her 2 children, my grandchildren Emma and Tyler, ages 8 and 12. It was a masterful manipulation, and despite everything, I had to admire the strategy. Hard to stay angry at someone when they're standing next to your grandchildren whom you haven't seen in 8 months. They found me at the warehouse, which Moira and I had converted into a proper showroom and appraisal center. The transformation had been dramatic. What had once been a dusty storage space was now an elegant display area with proper lighting, climate control, and carefully arranged exhibits of the finest pieces from local estate sales. I was photographing a Victorian tea service when I heard the rental car pull up outside. Through the window, I watched Jessica climb out of the driver's seat, looking around Kilbride with the same disdainful expression she'd worn the day she abandoned me. But when Emma and Tyler emerged from the back seat, my heart clenched painfully. They'd grown so much in 8 months. Emma had lost another tooth, and Tyler had shot up at least 3 inches. "Grandma Margaret!" Emma shrieked, running toward the warehouse door. I barely had time to set down my camera before she launched herself into my arms. Tyler followed more slowly, with the carefully controlled enthusiasm of a 12-year-old boy trying to look cool, but I could see the genuine happiness in his eyes. "I missed you so much," Emma whispered against my shoulder. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I said, and meant it completely. Jessica and Brian approached more cautiously, taking in the warehouse's transformation with obvious surprise. "This is not what I expected," Jessica said finally. "What did you expect?" She gestured vaguely around the showroom. "I don't know. Something smaller, I suppose. More rustic." Moira chose that moment to emerge from the office area, carrying a folder of appraisal documents and wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Margaret's daughter," she said, her Scottish accent somehow thicker than usual. "I'm Moira McLeod, her business partner." Jessica's eyes widened slightly at the business partner description, and I could practically see her recalculating whatever approach she'd planned to take. "Business partner?" Brian asked, looking around with newfound interest. "What kind of business?" "Antiques, estate sales, appraisals," I said simply. "We've been quite successful." "Successful enough to afford this renovation," Jessica observed, and I heard the old familiar tone, the one that implied I was being wastefully extravagant. "The renovation paid for itself," Moira interjected smoothly. "When you're dealing with high-value items, presentation matters. Our clients expect a certain level of professionalism." "Clients?" Brian asked, and I could see the dollar signs practically lighting up in his eyes. That's when Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma, can you show us around? This place looks like a museum." "It does, doesn't it?" I said, grateful for the distraction. "Would you like to see some of the treasures we've discovered?" For the next hour, I gave my grandchildren the same tour I gave to serious collectors and potential clients. Emma was fascinated by a collection of Victorian dolls, while Tyler was drawn to a display of medieval weapons and armor pieces. "Are these real?" he asked, examining a 16th-century Scottish dirk. "Completely authentic," I confirmed. "That particular piece belonged to a Highland clan chief. We're selling it next month to a collector in London." "For how much?" Jessica asked, appearing beside us. £12,000, I said casually, watching her eyes widen. 12,000? For one old knife? For a documented piece of Scottish history with provenance dating back 400 years, I corrected. Jessica walked around the showroom with increasing amazement, stopping to examine price tags and documentation. I could see her doing mental calculations, adding up the value of everything on display. "Mom," she said finally, "I had no idea. This is really something. Thank you. I mean it. You've built something impressive here." The old Margaret would have glowed under such praise from her daughter. The new Margaret recognized a setup when she heard one. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked quietly, drawing her away from where the children were playing. "Can't I just be proud of my mother?" "You can, but that's not why you're here." She looked around the showroom again, and when she turned back to me, the mask had slipped slightly. "Okay, fine. Yes, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished, but I'm also worried about you." "Worried about what?" "About you being taken advantage of. About this woman," she gestured toward Moira, "who was showing Tyler how to properly hold the antique dirk, using you for your knowledge and connections." I almost laughed. "Jessica, Moira saved me. When you abandoned me here, she gave me shelter, friendship, and opportunity. Everything I have now started because of her kindness. But are you sure she has your best interests at heart? Are you sure she's not just using you? The irony was breathtaking. My daughter, who had systematically drained my bank accounts and then abandoned me in a foreign country, was worried that someone might be using me. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Jessica glanced around to make sure the children weren't listening, then leaned closer. I think you should come home with us. Tonight. Pack up whatever's yours and come back to Minnesota where your family can look out for you. My family? Me, Brian, the kids. We made a terrible mistake, Mom, but we want to make it right. We want to take care of you properly this time. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the audacity. Take care of me? You're 67 years old, living in a foreign country with strangers. What happens if you get sick? What happens when you're too old to work? Who's going to look after you then? I'll manage, I said dryly. But you don't have to manage alone. That's what family is for. And despite everything I knew about my daughter, despite all the evidence of her selfishness and cruelty, some small part of me wanted to believe her. Some small part of me still craved her love and approval. Maybe that's why I made the mistake I was about to make. I'll think about it, I said. That evening I agreed to have dinner with Jessica and her family at the small hotel where they were staying in the next village. It was the first time in 8 months that we'd sat around a table together, and I found myself watching my daughter carefully, looking for signs of the woman who had abandoned me. But Jessica was charming that night. She asked thoughtful questions about my business, praised the photographs I showed her of our recent auction successes, and even apologized again, more thoroughly this time. I've been seeing a therapist, she said over dessert, while the children played quietly with the hotel's courtesy tablets. About anger management and family relationships. She helped me understand that what I did to you wasn't just cruel. It was abusive. The word hung in the air between us. Jessica had never acknowledged that her behavior might qualify as abuse. It was, I agreed quietly. I know. And I know that saying sorry isn't enough. I have to show you that I've changed, that I'm working to become the daughter you deserve. She reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, I love you. I should have said that more often over the years. I should have shown it better. But I do love you, and I want us to be a real family again. The old Margaret would have melted completely. Even the new Margaret felt a dangerous softening around the edges. What does that look like? I asked. Being a real family again? It means we make time for each other. It means I stop taking you for granted. It means the kids get to know their grandmother properly. Emma looked up from her tablet. Are you coming home with us, Grandma Margaret? The question was innocent, but it felt loaded with expectation. I looked around the table at these people who were my only family, who had traveled across an ocean to find me, who were saying all the things I'd longed to hear for years. I don't know, sweetheart, I said honestly. We could visit you here sometimes too, Tyler suggested. This place is actually pretty cool. Jessica smiled at her son's words. We could do that. Maybe we could even help with your business somehow. Brian's good with marketing and social media, aren't you, Brian? Brian nodded enthusiastically. I could set up a website for you, help you reach more customers online. This antique business has real potential, Margaret. With the right marketing strategy, you could probably expand beyond Scotland. For a moment, I let myself imagine it. A real reconciliation with my daughter. Grandchildren who knew me and wanted to spend time with me. A family business that bridged the ocean between us. It was seductive. It was everything I'd wanted. It was also probably too good to be true. But that night, back in my room above the Shepherd's Rest, I found myself seriously considering Jessica's offer to come home. Maybe people really could change. Maybe my daughter had genuinely learned from her mistakes. Maybe the cruelty I'd experienced had been an aberration, not her true character. I was still debating with myself when I heard voices outside my window. The hotel where Jessica was staying was only a few hundred yards away, and sound carried clearly across the quiet village at night. I recognized Brian's voice first, then Jessica's. They were standing outside the hotel, apparently having what sounded like a serious conversation. I couldn't make out individual words, but I could hear the tone, urgent, possibly argumentative. Curious, I opened my window slightly and leaned closer. Told you this was a waste of time, Brian was saying. She's not going to just hand over the business. She might, Jessica replied. Did you see how she reacted when Emma asked about coming home? She wants to believe we've changed. And if she doesn't believe it, then we move to plan B. I felt my blood turn to ice. Plan B? I still think Plan B is too risky, Brian said. What if she finds out? She won't find out. And even if she does, what's she going to do about it? She's 67 years old and living in a foreign country. Who's going to believe her over us? Their voices were getting fainter as they moved toward the hotel entrance. But I caught Jessica's final words. One way or another, Brian, we're not leaving Scotland empty-handed. I closed the window and sat on my bed in the darkness, my heart pounding. Jessica hadn't come to Scotland to reconcile with me. She'd come to steal from me. Again. The therapist, the apologies, the talk of being a real family. It was all an elaborate con game designed to get me to trust her long enough for her to figure out how to take what I'd built. I should have been devastated. The old Margaret would have been crushed by this final confirmation of her daughter's true nature. Instead, I found myself getting angry. Not sad, not hurt, furious. Jessica had stolen my savings, abandoned me in a foreign country, and now she was planning to steal my business too? She thought I was too old and too naive to protect myself? She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. I picked up my phone and called Moira. "It's late," she said when she answered. "Everything all right?" "No," I said grimly. "But it's about to be. We need to talk." The trap was elegant in its simplicity, and it was entirely Moira's idea. Over coffee the next morning, after I'd told her what I'd overheard, she'd smiled with the kind of cold satisfaction that reminded me why I'd never want to cross her. "So they think they can con you out of your business?" she'd said. "Well then, let's give them something to con you out of." The plan was this. I would pretend to be convinced by Jessica's Reconciliation Act. I would agree to return to Minnesota with them. But first, I would need to liquidate my share of the business and transfer the money to American accounts. This would require Jessica's help, since she understood American banking better than I did. Of course, the accounts I'd ask her to help me set up would be fake. The money I'd appear to transfer would be non-existent. And the liquidation of valuable antiques would actually be a carefully orchestrated removal of our least valuable inventory to a secure storage location. "The beautiful part," Moira explained, "is that they'll think they're stealing from ye when really they'll be stealing nothing. And in the process, they'll confess to exactly what they're planning to do." "And you're sure this will work?" "Margaret, I've been dealing with cons and schemers my entire life. Trust me, greed makes people stupid." She was right. Jessica took the bait immediately when I called her that afternoon. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her. "About coming home, about being a real family again." "And?" I could hear the excitement in her voice. "I think you're right. I think I should come back to Minnesota with you." The silence stretched out for several seconds, and I could practically hear her trying not to sound too eager. "Really? You mean that?" "I do, but it's complicated, Jessica. I can't just walk away from the business overnight. There are legal obligations, inventory to deal with, money to transfer." "Of course," she said quickly. "We understand that. How long do you think it would take to wrap things up?" "A few weeks, maybe a month, and I'd need help with some of the financial aspects. The banking systems are different here, and I want to make sure I don't lose money in the transfer process." "Brian and I could help with that," she offered immediately. "Brian's really good with finance and international banking." "I'll bet he is," I thought. "That would be wonderful," I said aloud. "Could you extend your trip? I know it's a lot to ask, but I could really use the support." "Absolutely. We'll change our flights. This is more important." Over the next week, Jessica and Brian became my constant companions. They helped me liquidate inventory. Actually, they helped us move our least valuable pieces into storage while we told them we were selling everything. They assisted with closing bank accounts. Actually, they helped us open several fake accounts with minimal balances while we told them we were consolidating my Scottish earnings. And through it all, Jessica played the role of the devoted daughter perfectly. She was attentive, helpful, and seemingly genuine in her desire to make amends. If I hadn't overheard that conversation outside the hotel, I might actually have believed her. The breakthrough came on day 8 of their extended visit. Brian had offered to help me transfer a large sum, supposedly $200,000 from the sale of our most valuable pieces, to an American account that he would help me set up. "The thing is, Margaret," he explained, "international transfers of this size can be tricky. Sometimes it's easier to route the money through multiple accounts to avoid taxation issues and currency exchange fees. Multiple accounts? Just temporarily. We set up a holding account, transfer the money there first, then move it to your permanent American account once we're back in Minnesota. And you'd have access to this holding account? Just to facilitate the transfers, Jessica added quickly. It would still be your money, of course. We'd just be helping you manage the technical aspects. I nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. You're both so much better with this kind of thing than I am. Exactly, Brian said, and I caught the quick glance he exchanged with Jessica. We just want to make sure you don't get taken advantage of by banks or currency exchange services. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That evening, I met with Moira and our solicitor, Duncan MacLeod's nephew James, to finalize the details of our trap. Everything was ready. The fake accounts, the false transfer confirmations, even fabricated documentation showing the fictional sale of our most valuable inventory. Are you sure about this? James asked. Once they attempt to access those accounts, they'll be committing fraud. Criminal fraud. I'm sure, I said. My daughter has stolen from me twice now. I won't give her the opportunity for a third time. And if they actually go through with it? If they try to take the money and disappear? Then we call the police and press charges. Moira nodded approvingly. They made their choice when they decided to con ye. Now they get to live with the consequences. The next morning, I told Jessica and Brian that everything was ready for the transfers. Are you excited? Jessica asked as we walked to the bank. About coming home, starting fresh? I looked at my daughter, this woman who had given me such joy as a child, such pain as an adult, and felt something surprisingly like pity. Yes, I said honestly. I'm excited about starting fresh, just not in the way she imagined. The call came at 6:47 a.m., 3 days after Jessica and Brian had returned to Minnesota with what they believed was access to my $200,000. I was having breakfast with Moira when my phone rang, showing Jessica's number. Mom? Her voice was shaking. We need to talk. Good morning, Jessica. How are you settling back in? There's a problem with the bank accounts, the ones Brian set up for your money transfer. What kind of problem? They're frozen. The bank says there was suspicious activity, and they've locked everything down pending an investigation. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. How strange. What do they mean by suspicious activity? I don't know. Brian's been on the phone with them for hours, but they won't tell us anything. They just keep saying there's an ongoing investigation. Well, I suppose that's concerning? Have you contacted the police? Silence. Then, the police? If there's been suspicious activity involving my money, shouldn't we report it to the authorities? I don't think that's necessary. These things usually resolve themselves. Do they? How convenient that you know so much about banking irregularities. Jessica. Another pause. Longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Harder. More desperate. Look, Mom, I think there might have been some kind of mistake in the transfer process. Could you call your bank in Scotland and ask them to resend the money? Maybe to a different account? Could I? I set down my coffee cup and smiled at Moira, who was listening to every word with obvious satisfaction. And which account would you like me to send it to this time? Brian has another account we could use temporarily, just until we figure out what went wrong with the first one. How helpful of Brian to have so many accounts available. Mom, please, we're trying to help you here. Are you? That's interesting, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to steal from me. Again, the silence this time was absolute. I don't know what you mean, Jessica said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. I mean that there was no $200,000. Jessica, I mean that the accounts Brian set up were fake, monitored by police financial crimes investigators. I mean that every conversation you had with those banks was actually with undercover officers gathering evidence. I could hear Jessica's breathing quicken on the other end of the line. That's impossible. We saw the documentation. We saw the transfer confirmations. You saw fabricated documents designed to catch you in exactly the kind of fraud you were planning. We weren't planning fraud. We were helping you. Were you? Then why did I overhear you and Brian outside your hotel discussing Plan B and how you weren't leaving Scotland empty-handed? Complete silence. The truth is, Jessica, you never came to Scotland to reconcile with me. You came because you learned I had money, And you wanted to steal it just like you stole my savings last year. The apologies, the therapy story, the promises about being a real family. It was all lies designed to manipulate me into trusting you long enough for you to rob me blind. That's not true. But her voice was weak now, defeated. Isn't it? Then why don't you call the police yourself, report this banking irregularity to the authorities, and let them sort it out? No response. I thought not. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Scottish countryside that had become my true home. Jessica, I gave you every opportunity to be a real daughter to me. I forgave your cruelty, your theft, your abandonment. I was even willing to believe you had changed, that you genuinely wanted to make amends. I did want that. I do want that. No, you don't. You want my money. You've always only wanted my money. And now you don't get either. Mom, please, let's talk about this reasonably. I know we made mistakes, but we can fix this. We? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. There is no we, Jessica. There's me, living my life in Scotland with people who genuinely care about me. And there's you, sitting in Minnesota trying to figure out how to explain to your husband why your latest con didn't work. It wasn't a con. Then what was it? Silence. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to leave me alone, completely alone. No more phone calls, no more manipulation, no more attempts to insert yourself into my life for financial gain. In exchange, I won't press charges for attempted fraud. You can't press charges. We didn't actually take any money. No, but you tried to. And you did take money last year. Money you stole from my accounts using forged documents. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on that, Jessica. I could hear her crying now, but it didn't move me the way it once would have. If you contact me again, I said firmly, if you show up in Scotland again, if you try any more schemes involving me or my business, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of both American and Scottish law. Are we clear? Mom, you can't just cut me out of your life. I'm your daughter. No, I said quietly. You were my daughter. Now you're just someone who shares my DNA and thinks that entitles her to my money. I hung up the phone and turned to Moira, who was watching me with an expression of pride. Well? She asked. It's over, I said, and felt a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying lift off my shoulders. It's finally over. 6 months later, MacLeod and Caldwell Antiquities was featured in a major article about successful British antique dealers. The photograph accompanying the article showed Moira and me standing in our showroom, surrounded by beautiful pieces we'd discovered and carefully researched. I was 78 in the article. I was wearing a designer suit I'd bought with my own money. I was standing in a business I'd helped build, and I was genuinely happy for the first time in decades. Jessica never called again. I heard through Linda that she and Brian had divorced, apparently over financial problems that I suspected were related to their failed attempt to steal from me. I didn't feel bad about it. My phone still gets messages sometimes from people who've heard my story. Women mostly, who've been financially abused by their own children, who've been made to feel like burdens instead of treasured family members. I always respond the same way. It's never too late to start over, and you're stronger than you think you are. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. Jessica thought she was abandoning me when she left me on that Scottish roadside. Actually, she was setting me free. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.